There's a two-time world champion on the grid right now who might be racing his final season in Formula One, and he's already told everyone exactly what would make him walk away. Fernando Alonso hasn't officially announced his retirement. But make no mistake, the entire paddock is already bracing for the possibility that his time in this sport is running out, and the way he's been talking about it lately makes it feel more real than it's ever felt before. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this season could be the last time we see one of the greatest drivers of his generation on the grid. Let's start with the facts. Alonso turned 45 this year, making him by far the oldest driver on the current grid, with a record number of race starts spanning 25 years since his debut back in 2001. Think about that timeline for a moment. He's raced against multiple generations of drivers, watched teammates come and go, and seen the sport completely transform around him. From the cars he first sat in as a rookie to the hybrid, driver-assisted machinery on the grid today. His contract with Aston Martin runs out at the end of this season, and for the first time, he's been remarkably open about what might come next. Here's the key detail that's driving all this speculation, and it's honestly one of the more fascinating things a driver at this level has ever said publicly. Alonso has stated, in his own words, that if Aston Martin manages to build a genuinely competitive car this year, that would actually be the ideal moment for him to walk away. Think about that for a second, because it runs completely against how most professional athletes think. Most drivers chase competitive machinery because they want more of it, more wins, more championships, more years at the very top of the sport. Alonso is essentially saying the opposite, that finally getting the car he's been chasing for years might be exactly the signal that it's time to stop. Not the reason to keep going. Why would a two-time world champion think that way? Because for Alonso, this was never just about staying on the grid for its own sake, collecting appearances or padding a record. He's been clear, repeatedly, that he doesn't need to keep racing to prove anything to anyone at this stage of his career. What he wants is to close out his story on his own terms, ideally with a taste of real success one more time, rather than fading out quietly in an uncompetitive car season after season, chasing points, finishes instead of podiums. And there's real substance behind why this year specifically could finally be that moment. Aston Martin brought in Adrian Newey, arguably the greatest car designer in the entire history of the sport, specifically to lead their technical push under the brand new 2026 regulations. This wasn't a small hire. This was the team signaling as clearly as possible that they intend to compete at the front. Newey himself has acknowledged the team got a late start in their wind tunnel program compared to rivals, publicly admitting that would likely cost them early in the season. But the long-term project is exactly what Alonso has been waiting years for, a genuine shot at competing for wins and podiums before he's done, something that's largely eluded him during his time at Aston Martin so far. So this puts Alonso in a genuinely unusual position heading into the second half of this season. Every strong result Aston Martin puts together doesn't just help the championship standings, it actively pushes him closer to a decision about walking away for good. Every disappointing weekend, ironically, might be the very thing that keeps him racing another year, because he's said clearly that if the team isn't competitive, it would be very hard for him to give up without trying again. That's an emotional tightrope most drivers never have to walk. Walk, wanting your team to succeed while knowing that success might be what ends your own career. This is exactly why other drivers, and the wider paddock are starting to react to the idea of an Alonso retirement, even without any official announcement having been made. He represents one of the last true links to a completely different era of the sport. Someone who made his debut when several current drivers on the grid weren't even born yet. When someone with that kind of history and longevity starts talking openly, even carefully, about the end, people around him pay very close attention, even if nothing is confirmed yet. Alonso himself has tried to downplay the urgency at every turn, saying he's taking this season day by day, that he doesn't have a crystal ball, and that his answer about retirement would basically stay valid no matter when you ask him. But reading between the lines, that kind of careful, deliberately vague language from a driver this experienced, this media-trained, this used to controlling the narrative around him, usually means the decision is a lot closer than he's letting on publicly. So what should we actually be watching for as this season plays out? Keep a close eye on how competitive Aston Martin's car genuinely becomes as the season progresses, because based on Alonso's own words, that's the single biggest factor that will decide this one way or another. Watch for any change in his tone during press conferences, particularly after strong race results, because that's often where drivers let their real intentions slip out despite trying to stay neutral in front of the cameras. And watch closely how Aston Martin's management, especially team owner Lawrence Stroll, talks about their long-term driver lineup going forward, since any hints about succession planning would tell us a great deal about what they're quietly expecting behind the scenes. Nothing is confirmed yet. Alonso hasn't retired, and depending on how this season goes, he might not for another year or two. But the pieces are lining up in a way that makes this feel like a real possibility for the first time in his long career, and that alone is enough to make every remaining race weekend this year worth watching a little differently than before. Let me know in the comments, do you think this is Alonso's final season in Formula One, or does he find a way to keep going even without the results he's chasing? Subscribe for more, because whatever he ultimately decides, it's going to be one of the biggest storylines in this sport before the year is over.